At the crossroads of history, nations often face choices whose consequences echo through generations. In recent years, Georgia has once again arrived at such a juncture. Long committed to Euro-Atlantic integration, the country has unexpectedly begun moving closer to Russia. This shift has drawn criticism from the West and segments of Georgian society, while media outlets have pointed to personal ties between Georgian political elites and Russian business circles, as well as signs of authoritarianism and corruption. Yet, what if these decisions stem from deeper geopolitical forces? Could it be that Georgia, in pursuing a new course, has actually made the most rational move in its modern history? Or has it in fact taken a wrong turn? History is merciless to the weak. Small nations face a stark choice: submit to a powerful protector or risk disappearing from the political map. Georgia is a vivid example of such a dilemma. In the 18th century, fragmented into principalities and kingdoms, Georgia was under constant threat from Persia and the Ottoman Empire. Seeking protection and dynastic survival, King Heraclius II of Kartli Kakheti signed the Treaty of Georgievsk, making Georgia a vassal of the Russian Empire. But instead of the promised guardianship came full annexation in 1801 and the abolition of the Georgian monarchy. A brief period of independence in the early 20th century was cut short by a Red Army invasion, bringing Soviet rule to Georgia. Within the USSR, despite a facade of prosperity and industrial growth, the republic was plagued by corruption and technological stagnation, leaving it vulnerable after the Soviet collapse in 1991. With independence came chaos. Soviet ties were severed, and with them Georgia's economy crumbled. Inflation skyrocketed into the thousands of percent. Corruption became endemic. Stagnation and a rise in nationalism inflamed dormant internal tensions that had been suppressed under the Soviet regime. Armed conflict erupted in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, leading to the de facto secession and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. Georgia became known as a post-Soviet crime hotspot, rife with both street-level and organized crime. Still worse, leaving the USSR meant losing access to the shared energy grid. Domestic power production dropped by half, plunging the country into a deep energy crisis. Even in the capital, Tbilisi, electricity was available only for a few hours a day. Imagine an entire city shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the occasional car headlights. Unable to pay its debts, Georgia saw gas deliveries from Turkmenistan cut off. Even suburban transport ceased to function. People had to walk long distances just to reach neighboring villages. This continued until 2003. Georgia's president at the time, Eduard Shevardnadze, a former Soviet foreign minister, though not overtly pro-Russian, reluctantly agreed to allow Russia to maintain military bases in Akhalkalaki and Batumi. With the Rose Revolution in 2003, Mikhail Saakashvili came to power and launched sweeping reforms aimed at bringing Georgia closer to the West. Cracking down on corruption, slashing bureaucratic red tape, and opening the country to foreign investment, Saakashvili also openly challenged Moscow, demanding the withdrawal of Russian troops from Georgian soil. By 2007, Russia had reluctantly pulled its forces from Georgia's main territory, but maintained a presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia under the guise of peacekeeping missions. Saakashvili's 2008 attempt to regain control of Abkhazia and South Ossetia by military means triggered a harsh response from Russia and resulted in Georgia's definitive loss of those regions. Russia recognized their independence and established a permanent military presence, leaving the threat to Georgia's territorial integrity a constant concern. The principle of divide and conquer has been known for millennia, and in this case its application is anything but coincidental. Russia's foothold in these two regions is not just strategic, it is both a necessary and sufficient condition for exerting pressure on Georgia's statehood. We will explore this further shortly. After the 2008 war, Georgia not only avoided a developmental slowdown, it actually gained momentum. Thanks to its pro-business climate, openness to investment, and substantial government spending, the city of Batumi began to transform from a neglected backwater into the jewel of Georgia's Black Sea coast. It became an icon of Georgian transformation. In the following years, Batumi overtook Kutaisi in population and emerged as Georgia's second-largest city, and in some respects even its leading one. Tbilisi, too, once notorious for crime and instability, evolved into one of the safest cities in Europe. Yet Saakashvili's presidency and political trajectory were not destined to last. Following a reckless and ill-conceived war, the rise of authoritarian tendencies within his administration, and mounting allegations of prisoner abuse and politically motivated persecution of opponents, Saakashvili lost public support. As a result, in 2012, Georgia witnessed its first peaceful transfer of power since independence. The opposition coalition Georgia Dream, led by billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, secured 55% of the vote, defeating President Mikhail Saakashvili's United National Movement, which garnered 40%. Ivanishvili, a former Russian businessman who attained Georgian citizenship only in 2004, faced frequent accusations of maintaining personal ties with the Russian leadership. While such claims are speculative and lack public evidence, our focus here is not to assess their validity. Instead, we aim to demonstrate that Georgia's foreign policy trajectory is shaped by broader political factors, irrespective of any personal affiliations within its leadership. Between 2012 and 2022, Georgia gradually deepened its economic ties with Russia. Trade relations were restored, with exports to Russia increasing from 2% to 14.5%, primarily driven by wine and agricultural products. The import of Russian natural gas rose from 2.8% to 23%, heightening Georgia's energy dependence on its northern neighbor. Russian tourists once again became a significant component of Georgia's tourism sector. By 2022, as the war in Ukraine erupted, Georgia found itself economically intertwined with Russia and heavily reliant on energy imports from both Russia and Azerbaijan. The surge in wine and agricultural exports to Russia, the uptick in Russian gas supplies, and the return of Russian tourists meant that any regional instability posed a direct threat to Georgia's economy and energy security. Simultaneously, Western partners intensified pressure on Georgia to implement stricter sanctions against Russia. However, in the realm of high-stakes politics, moral considerations often take a backseat, and one nation's catastrophe can become another's opportunity. In 2022, remittances from Russia to Georgia exceeded $2 billion, nearly 6 times the amount of the previous year, making up 8.5% of Georgia's GDP at the time. From March 2022 to June 2023, nearly 20,000 Russians registered in Georgia as individual entrepreneurs, more than doubling the total from the previous 25 years. Following Russia's announcement of partial mobilization, over 700,000 Russian nationals entered Georgia, with approximately 100,000 choosing to stay. As a result, Georgia's GDP grew by over 10% in 2022. The Georgian lari appreciated by 13% against the US dollar, prompting the National Bank of Georgia to bolster its foreign currency reserves to a record $5 billion to prevent excessive currency strengthening. Additionally, some sanctioned goods began reaching Russia via Georgia through parallel imports. For Georgia, foregoing this economic momentum would have been self-defeating. Yet such windfalls are typically short-lived, and immediate economic gains risked undermining years of carefully cultivated relationship with Western nations. Russia's military setbacks in Ukraine might have seemed like an opportunity for Georgia to reclaim control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia through force. Later, Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili revealed that Ukraine had urged Georgia to take more decisive action, including opening a second front against Russia. However, Georgia could not embark on such a course alone. Even weakened by the war in Ukraine, Russia maintained military superiority in the region. Experts estimate that Russia's contingent in Abkhazia and South Ossetia comprises about 10,000 troops, while the Georgian army totals around 37,000 personnel. A conflict with Russia would have been conceivable only with comprehensive support from Western countries, particularly the deployment of NATO forces in Georgia, akin to the presence in the Baltic states or Poland. But observing this situation in Ukraine, Georgia drew clear conclusions about the capabilities and reserve of the European Union and the United States. Specifically, their reluctance to take measures against Russia beyond economic sanctions. Opening a second front would have immediately cost Georgia 25% of its exports and jeopardized tourism, which accounts for 20% of its GDP. The country would have faced a formidable adversary alone. What's crucial, this adversary already held a metaphorical dagger poised over Georgia's head and heart. This brings us to why control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia is not merely a punitive measure against Georgia's pro-Western stance, but a strategic geopolitical mechanism. The explanation lies in Georgia's geography. Georgia is a natural fortress. Its core territory lies between the Greater Caucasus Mountains to the north and the Lesser Caucasus Mountains to the south. The Greater Caucasus Range runs along the entire border with Russia. For ground forces and armored units, crossing it is a formidable challenge even without any resistance. A relatively small defending force can effectively block mountain passes and hold an advancing army. Consequently, the most straightforward route from Russia into Georgia is by sea. However, amphibious landings are among the most complex military operations, invariably resulting in significant casualties for the attacking force. Such operations are rare in history and are scarcely feasible under modern conditions. Another option is the narrow coastal strip along the Black Sea between Sochi and Gagri. Yet here the Caucasus Mountains nearly touch the sea, leaving only a slender bottleneck. In such terrain, the Russian army would lose its primary advantages – numerical strength and maneuverability. Lacking control over Abkhazia does not entirely preclude Russia from launching an offensive, but it certainly renders such an operation exceedingly difficult and costly in every respect. Conversely, possessing control over Abkhazia provides Russia with a strategic foothold, immediately threatening Georgia's entire Black Sea coastline. Just 30 kilometers from Abkhazia lies Poti, Georgia's largest port, handling the majority of its imports. Another 100 kilometers across flat terrain is Batumi, Georgia's second-largest city and port, through which all overland imports from Turkey pass. Georgia's two lowland regions are connected by its sole highway, near which sits Kutaisi, the country's third-largest and final major city. Thus, control over the western coastal territory in the event of war would automatically deprive Georgia of 60% of its total imports and likely 100% of its military imports. However, this might be still insufficient for a swift defeat, as the capital, Tbilisi, is situated on the eastern Kartli Plain, separated from the western Caucasus Plain by the Liki Range. This range is also nearly impassable for heavy equipment, if even basic defenses are in place. This is where South Ossetia becomes pivotal. The 4-kilometer-long rocket tunnel, situated at the altitude of 2,000 meters, allows troops, vehicles and armored units to cross the Greater Caucasus from North Ossetia to South Ossetia relatively easily. Built in 1984, it was at the time the only route across the Caucasus passable year-round, including in winter. In a sense, South Ossetia serves as a Trojan horse, enabling Russia to bypass the fortress walls of the Greater Caucasus and gain direct access to the Kartli Plain. Tbilisi lies less than 100 kilometers away across the plain. This was precisely the route Russian forces took in 2008, and naturally, Georgia is determined to prevent a recurrence. Therefore, the recent geopolitical reorientation of Georgia may be driven not only by the personal interests of its ruling elite, but also by objective economic, political and geographical factors. In this context, the Georgian government has likely adopted the most pragmatic approach, avoiding direct confrontation with Russia, which would entail economic harm and military threats, in exchange for the uncertain prospects of European integration. By openly declaring its non-alignment with the anti-Russian alliance, Georgia denies Russia formal pretexts for escalating bilateral tensions, even if such escalation would align with the Kremlin's interests. Simultaneously, Georgia avoids becoming directly dependent on Russia. The two countries never restored diplomatic relations since the 2008 war, and in 2025, Prime Minister Irakli Kabahidze stated that there are no prerequisites for doing so. Maintaining balance while preserving independence is one of the most challenging arts that politics has sought to master over centuries. Georgia's recent foreign policy exemplifies a fundamental law of nature: adopt or perish.